Dave Brubeck was one of the early quartets that I listened to and bought in one of his early records. I started listening to jazz when I was in college, particularly when I was in the fraternity house. A good friend of mine, Cam Deathridge, brought a number of records. One of his favorites was the Modern Jazz Quartet. Very nice jazz. Yeah. Out of that was the Dave Brubeck Quartet. And certainly the work of Paul Desmond. That was certainly what we listened to in our college years. And when we came to Toronto, therefore we came to listen to the jazz musicians that were particularly in that West Coast school of jazz. Similar to that, I acquired the three other records from the Bethlehem collection. We're listening to some of the work of Terry Pollard. Terry Pollard cut this album for Bethlehem. One of the reasons I bought these, I've got three of them here, these Bethlehem records, is mainly because of the art on the record jacket. You'll see that they use monochrome colors for each of these. Here's Terry Pollard. Paula Castle singing Lost Love.
My thoughts are clinging to a lost love that just never fades.
And Aaron Sachs on horn. None of these were nationally well-known jazz artists, but they worked a lot in the local clubs and were recorded by Bethlehem and as part of this series. And Bethlehem spent a little money on getting using these monochrome designs, which set them apart. And I certainly have enjoyed over the years the listening to the music on these three records. This is a Herbie Mann playing now. Under the album is Herbie Mann Plays. It's an anniversary album for Herbie Mann on flute. It's a Bethlehem record, similar to two or three of the other artists. And Bethlehem became noted for their cover designs simply because each one was in a monochrome style, highly stylized, and very distinctive. Like the big dance bands. This album is Benny Goodman the great years, and it sounds like the full band. He's playing Don't Be That Way, which was the opening number of their famous Carnegie Hall jazz concert in 1940s. It didn't have many big band records, but this one was good, and it had all of his great numbers on. Oh, here's Nat King Cole in a nice little number, Dream a Little Dream of Me. Yeah, I like Nat. This is the 10th anniversary album, so it's a few years ago. This is Sarah Vaughan singing George Gershwin songs. And the one you're hearing is I Won't Say I Will, I Won't Say I Won't. Sarah Vaughan was my favorite jazz singer. I really liked her voice and her styling. And this particular number is A Foggy Day in London Town. Here we go. Sarah Vaughan had a unique voice, and I think it had better tonal qualities than even some of the other blues singers like Ella Fitzgerald. She didn't cut as many records or achieve as much fame, but her records are well known, and her work is well regarded. This is Dizzy Gillespie with a range of his better known numbers. This is Laura and the Misty Night, one of Earl Gardner's signature numbers. And this is from an album of Earl Gardner Gems, a selection of many of his best-known pieces. And it was nice in the collection. I like the piano playing of Earl Gardner. It's a little more laid back, a little more West Coast. Not as frenzy as Oscar Peterson, but certainly I enjoyed very much. I enjoyed the piano work of each of these two great artists.
I've got a right to cry. I've got a right to cry. All day I sing the blues. I'm in my lonely shoes.
Here we're listening to Laverne Smith, sometimes known as the New Orleans Nightingale. I liked her, and she's singing here, I've Got a Right to Cry. She's a good, solid blues singer, and her styling is what I would call 11 o'clock bar night after the crowd has settled down, and good listening. You can see some of her personal styling in that number. Got a right to cry. This is Ahmed Jamal, one of my favorite jazz pianists. And what you're hearing is the first opening number from on the Tranquility album. Ahmed Jamal has done a number of albums. One of his best numbers is Poinciana. My wife Janet and I saw Ahmed Jamal in concert in Seattle many years ago. We happened to be in town and went with friends and had a very pleasant evening listening to Ahmed Jamal. Well, it was 1956, and I graduated from the University of Western Ontario. I had a job that I was to start in September of that year, and I went to Toronto. I started out in a rooming house down near Spadina and Bloor Street. Near the university, and then later moved to another shared an apartment. Well, Toronto wasn't always a center for jazz. Toronto, up until the early 1950s, was a pretty dull place. The whole province of Ontario had been a dry province, and the Women's Christian Temperance Association (WCTU) certainly was dominant in developing the what were known as the Blue Laws. The Blue Laws really restricted setting up any bars or cocktail lounges, except in certain cases in hotels and in private clubs. And in hotels, the bars would only be open to the hotel guests. So things were pretty quiet. And in the early 50s, things started to change, and the Blue Laws started to be rescinded. And on the basis of that, certain of the coffee clubs, we used to have little coffee houses, started to come up. The Beat generation started to be a little more prominent, and bars and restaurants, particularly restaurants that could serve wine and beer and cocktails, started to open up. One of the early ones that we would go to when we went to Toronto on football weekends, for instance, would be a little French restaurant on Church Street. I remember the candles in the wine bottles and the red checkered tablecloths. It was a small restaurant, but it was a beginning. The next one that I can remember is the Sharda House, which was Hungarian. And pretty lively. I remember that they had lively music there. It wasn't necessarily jazz. And then the third one I can recall is the Barrooms Steakhouse, a very, very small steakhouse on Church Street, around Church and Dundas. So these were some of the first restaurants that got started in the 1950s. And then in time, many of the places opened up. The Silver Rail is a bar and a cocktail lounge, the Town Tavern, and certainly the Plaza Room opened up to the general public and started to provide jazz work for jazz musicians. The jazz musicians became a certain fixture in the nightlife of Toronto. Certainly Toronto adopted American jazz with a wholehearted embrace. And many of us went to these places for just to listen to the jazz and have one or two drinks. Because when we were all getting started in our careers, that's about all we could afford. In the late 1950s, I was living in a apartment on East Street West with three other guys from Western. And on Friday nights, we'd go to various jazz presentations and jazz groups, and go to see jazz groups and so on. One of the places that we went quite a bit was George's Spaghetti House. It was over near, if I recall, it was Parliament, a little to the east of Yonge Street. And it was in an old bar, and they turned it into a bit of a restaurant and a jazz club. Jazz was very good, was informal, very informal place, and we would go there usually in groups of people, guys and gals, and would not necessarily be too dressed up for it. It was a pretty casual place. It had been a beer hall before, and because we were all just starting out in our careers, it was a relatively inexpensive evening. It was very popular with a lot of the young college grads that were just coming into Toronto and starting their career. And one of I would often go down with my other three roommates. We shared an apartment in Toronto. One night, however, one of our roommates, Ed Case by name, got so enthused at the end of the night that he invited everybody back to continue the party in our apartment. And so people arrived and with cases of beer, and with one of the jazz players, I think, came along with it. And when they arrived at the apartment, they piled into the elevator, which overloaded the elevator, and it got stuck. And that caused great calls to the for the superintendent, and in order to get people out, they had to call one of the emergency service people from the elevator company. Eventually, people piled out, and they all went home. Keep in mind, this was 2 o'clock in the morning. The next morning, the superintendent knocked on our door and told us that we were no longer welcome in their apartment building, and we had disturbed all of the residents at the middle of the night, and we were to be gone as soon as we could clear ourselves out of the building. And so we did. We went to George's Spaghetti House often, particularly on Friday nights. It had jazz musicians every week, and there would be a different one each week. One of the most famous ones there was Mo Kaufman. one of his best numbers was a jazz number called the Swinging Shepherd Blues. It hit the charts and did very well for a period of about a year. Even today, those of us that are can remember back in those days can with great fondness remember some of the songs. I remember certainly the Swinging Shepherd Blues, and I was delighted to see the record again. Mo was one of the few Canadians that rose during the jazz scene in Toronto. When jazz was just getting started and opening up, a lot of the jazz players were Americans who came up for certain short gigs in various clubs. Mo Kaufman and Oscar Peterson were two of the Canadian jazz players that developed during this period. And it was partly due to them that a lot of us as young folks really got interested in jazz. Here's one of my early albums from Oscar Peterson, a Canadian. I think he started in Montreal, but he played a lot in Toronto, and he played at many of the clubs. This is an album of Oscar Peterson, a Canadian jazz pianist. Right now we're listening to the Maidens of Cadiz, a number on his album The Jazz Soul of Oscar Peterson. Oscar Peterson was a world-renowned jazz pianist. He played in many of the clubs throughout Europe. He was well regarded in Sweden, Germany, and Switzerland, and he also played many of the jazz clubs in the U.S., both in San Francisco and New York. He was one of the few Canadians who became known in the jazz scene, which is basically an American cultural thing, and he became known worldwide and played worldwide during the 50s and 60s. Oscar Peterson playing Liza with his fabulous finger rolls. This is part of his technique that made him famous. Oscar was really a fantastic piano player. He could go up and down those keys about as fast as anybody we've ever seen, and in his playing, around the melodies, he would have a number of piano riffs, which were quite amazing, and he was extremely good for almost most of his life. He passed away just recently, and we lost a good Canadian performer. But he certainly was instrumental in establishing the jazz scene in Toronto and Montreal. Now, the Plaza Room, where Oscar Peterson played a lot, was a cocktail lounge, and it was part of the Park Plaza Hotel, which is located at the corner of Bloor and Avenue Road. The Plaza Room was just off the main lobby, and was the center of a lot of activity, particularly when major jazz musicians came, like Lionel Hampton. It was very sophisticated, and when we all dressed up in our three-piece suits and had dates that we wanted to impress, we went to listen to the jazz. Lionel Hampton, Oscar Peterson, and many others. It was the place to go for a good upscale date, and very sophisticated. Certainly, you wouldn't get in past the door if you just showed up in jeans and a t-shirt.
Go.
Here's a record of Lionel Hampton. Lionel was one of the American jazz players that came to the Toronto scene. He played quite a bit in the Plaza Room. This is an album from Lionel Hampton. It's one of the albums that came out in the 1950s. It is called Many Splendored Vibes, because he plays the vibraphone, and quite well too. We're listening to Three Coins in a Fountain. It's a favorite, and it particularly lends itself to a rendition by vibraphones. This was a time before credit cards were invented. We had to pay cash, and so we required to save up our pennies over the week in order to have sufficient money for a date. The ladies, our dates, often ordered special drinks, and we were always worried that they may have ordered one too many and we didn't have enough cash for the bill. But we had many great evenings at the Plaza Room. And that's how jazz came to Toronto. Are you sure you got the right thing?
Yeah. It's 2 albums. It's a double album.
Oh, right.
All right, rolling.
Here's a picture of Mo Kaufman, who went to the jazz.
There you go.
Okay.
And we're rolling. Glasses. 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 There you go.
You're a good director.
Oh, this is Don't Be That Way by Benny Goodman. This is one of my favorites. This was the opening number in Benny Goodman's famous 1938 Carnegie Hall concert. It's the first time a jazz musician had been invited to Carnegie Hall, so it was a big deal. The band was very tense and uptight that night, and this is not the live version, but in the live version, Gene Krupa, the famous drummer, did a crazy drum solo in the middle of it, said to wake everybody up, which he did, and it loosened everybody up, and from that point on, they swung like they normally swung. So I always think of that tale when I hear this song. But this one is Benny Goodman, The Great Years, a great album.